Well, thanks everyone for coming today. It's great to have you here despite the weather. Sorry about the trek across campus if you were coming from outside the building. I'm Jim Goldgeier, Dean of the School of International Service, and it's just a wonderful pleasure to have Tara Sonenshine here from George Washington University. Tara Sonenshine has worked across multiple sectors, government, nonprofits, and the media. She served as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs under both Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry. And she's currently Distinguished Fellow in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Her high-level experience in the media includes producing news programs for network television and authoring articles for national print and online media. And she's the winner of 10 News Emmy Awards and other awards in journalism for programs on domestic and international affairs. And it's wonderful to have you here with us, and it's wonderful to have folks on the live stream watching as well. This is an area of public diplomacy where I think the two institutions that are represented here on the stage, GW and American, are really at the forefront in work in this area. So it's wonderful to be able to have you here and also think about ways the two institutions can collaborate as we try to think about how to push this forward. Turns out this afternoon, Tara's successor, Rick Stengel, was sworn in this afternoon as the new Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy. So it seems like a very opportune time to think about what it is that he's supposed to do now that he's the new Undersecretary. And I thought we'd start by just having you give us a sense of how you saw the job, the major challenges, and what you think is facing Rick Stengel as he starts the job today.
Well, thank you. And firstly, let me just take note of how fortunate all of you are to have Jim Goldgeier, and would you give him a round of applause for setting up all these talks. He's worked, as you know, in every sector, government, academia. So we've been colleagues for many years, and it's really a delight to be with all of you. So yes, Rick Stengel has a new job today, and I've gotten a few calls saying, so what does he have to do now that he's sitting in what is a beautiful office that person holds? It was actually the office of George Marshall. So you do sit there with a sense of history. I would say the first thing that the new Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs has to do is make sure everyone knows what public diplomacy is in his building, in the administration, in the country, and in the world. Now, if I cornered any of you, and don't worry, I won't do this to you, and said, tell me in a phrase, public diplomacy is, are there any brave souls beyond the two up front who know all too well what public diplomacy is? Anyone want to venture a guess? Smart. So public diplomacy is really a way in which we, meaning in this case the U.S. government, if you're talking about U.S. public diplomacy, as we will get into, many countries now utilize public diplomacy. But it really is your way as a government of communicating with publics overseas, is how it was initially thought of. We'll come back to the challenges of what is overseas in the modern world of 2014. But it was designed as a way to extend your national security, your values, your interests, and project those out to the overseas community. Now that is about as classic as you can get. But as we all know, this field of international relations is very complicated. So having now given you a kind of baseline, I'm going to add one sentence to complicate it all. Does anyone see that extension, that cord plugged into the wall over there? It's a simple device that looks like there's a power source and a cord. In my view, public diplomacy is a big extension cord. In the wall is what your U.S. government's interests, values, foreign policy, and you want to take that cord and wrap it around the entire planet, basically. You want to plug in from your values and interests to publics, and that's where it gets very confusing. But that's an image to give you. I'm welcoming a colleague from the State Department who's managed to come down, Donna Wolf, and check on me.
So how are we doing at public diplomacy?
You know, somebody asked me the other day how we were doing with public diplomacy, and I said it would be sort of like asking Moses how Moses was doing around the time of getting the Jews out of Egypt. How many of you know what a Seder is? Passover. So in thinking about the story of Passover, I realized that Moses was one of the early practitioners of public diplomacy. Stay with me for a moment. Suddenly everybody's chairs moved in.
Right. We're picturing Charlton Heston.
Yes, we're picturing Charlton Heston. God sends Moses on a mission to Egypt, much like Ambassador Quainton might have been sent to Lebanon or someplace. God says to Moses, on my behalf, this is a pretty official request if you think about it, a tasking to Moses, go and do some public diplomacy with the Pharaoh. Tell the Pharaoh to let his people go. How did Moses do on the public diplomacy mission? At the beginning, not so good. Pharaoh said, no, no, no. I will not let my people go. How did he do when you fast forward? Now, no blogging for Moses, no tweets. Finally, the people got out. Took them 40 days and 40 nights. They made their way. How is Moses doing today with those people who got to the promised land? You know what I say? Time will tell. And when people say, how are we doing with public diplomacy? It depends on the snapshot in time you take and what your ultimate long-term, you have a short-term, mid-term, and long-term. And you might be doing great on Tuesday and not so well next month and really great a year from now. So I think anyone who tries to tell you A+ for public diplomacy or failing probably is not giving you the full picture. How's that for a dodge?
So we'll come at it from a different angle, which is as we think about the different arms of the U.S. government, things like the Voice of America and entities that help project the message, it gets a little blurry because you have reporters, for example, from VOA, who they consider themselves to be reporters. They're journalists. And yet it's an entity of the U.S. government. So how does that work where you've got these different ways in which the United States can get the message out, but the individuals who work in these entities may not necessarily see themselves as agents of the U.S. government. In fact, quite the opposite. They may see themselves as there to be reporters just like any other reporter who's with a private institution.
So VOA, or what you've mentioned, let's go back now that we've defined what the idea is. We're going to influence and kind of persuade people overseas, or at least explain our values and interests. What are the tools in the toolkit? Because if I'm going to use that extension cord and connect my U.S. government policy to each and every one of you, wherever in the world you are, I'm going to have to choose some tools. And back to Rick Stengel and his new job, he's going to have to look at what are the tools that I have some ownership of. One, we know social media, big tool. Moses couldn't tweet, but we can. Facebook, blogs, all the social media tools you can think of. The tool you mentioned, Voice of America, would be a quasi-tool. And let me explain why. Has anyone heard of Voice of America here? Okay. Who does Voice of America belong to? Who pays a Voice of America correspondent salary? Anybody have an idea? U.S. taxpayers. Yes, indeed. Congress. Congress funds the Voice of America. Now, if I asked if I, as the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy, can tell Voice of America what to report, Donna, what would the answer be? No. No. Because the philosophy for that tool is that we want independent journalists to be able to go out and report and not feel that they are just simply extension cords directly of the U.S. government. Very confusing example. Now, if I asked you, can I go to the State Department podium and make a statement where I can shape that message, Donna, what would the answer be? Yes. Yes. My podium, but not my Voice of America correspondent. Mm-hmm. So in asking each of these, if you ask, can I utilize student exchanges as a way of influencing and carrying my story forward? Yes, for some, if it's a Fulbright or Gilman, but I don't really own every student exchange in the United States, except, of course, when you go to get a visa, and then the State Department owns everything. So there are tools, student engagement, social media, traditional media, the podium, the Facebook, the official, travel and tourism, all kinds of ways that people come and go in this wide arena called public diplomacy.
So let's move to a couple specific cases, because we've watched, for a long time, we've watched Syria unfold. For a more condensed time, we've watched the events in Ukraine unfold. And there are a number of countries trying to get their message out there and frame the issue for people both domestically and internationally. If we start with Ukraine, where we've seen the Russian government be very aggressive about using messaging that they've been arguing is messaging they learned from us to apply to this case, it's become very challenging. We're trying to make this argument that the Russian government has acted illegitimately. This is not the kind of international order that we want to see. We don't believe the countries should simply be able to go and take territory from other countries without, without any say from that country. They are making the argument that, the United States has intervened elsewhere. The United States encouraged the independence of Kosovo, and that they're simply doing the same kinds of things that the United States has done in the past. That makes it very difficult for the United States to get its message across, and we've seen a coordinated message that I don't really care for about sort of, this is the 21st century, not the 19th century. I don't actually think the centuries have anything to do with this, but it is a coordinated message that the United States has been trying to get across. But it's been quite challenging. We've tried to use the United Nations in this endeavor, but this really is a case where public diplomacy is central to how this is all playing out in internationally as well as domestically.
Every conflict zone and non-conflict zone that you could choose today, Ukraine, Syria, every single international relations event has this public diplomacy element, and I'll come back to Mr. Putin specifically and to Syria. But why do I say that everything has this public diplomacy component? Imagine an intersection. Communications, information, news, media, and global international relations. Right at that intersection is public diplomacy and public affairs. Why? Because at the end of the day, publics matter. And if they didn't matter, Mr. Putin might not be saying or doing certain things. The United Nations would not be doing or saying. You have somebody who's the recipient, the receiving end of all of this. Now let's take Mr. Putin and try to figure out what his public diplomacy strategy is. How many of you think he has a strategy that you can discern? You believe there's a strategy? You believe there's a strategy? You believe there's a strategy. So let's take it from the public diplomacy angle. I began to study Mr. Putin's public diplomacy about 15 years ago, when I began to notice not only Russian public diplomacy, Chinese public diplomacy, Indian public diplomacy, somehow this notion of influencing publics began to creep in to the story. And what would have given me notice? First thing I saw is that Mr. Putin's Russia hired a public relations firm in New York. Go and check it. I think it might have been Ketchum. It was one of the major public relations firms, but I want to be careful and say I'm not sure which one. But you can go back and find, if you really dig deeply, why would the Russians hire a public relations firm years ago, right after, in about 2000? Can anybody guess what could they have been thinking about? Well, I'll answer my own rhetorical question and say the Russians had begun early, even pre that point, to concern themselves with their international image. How does the world see us? And they commissioned some polls. And some of the polling, and everybody's, I see, very interested in this because it is a mystery story. Some of the polls suggested that the view of Russia in the United States was very negative. And what was one means? They looked at film. They looked at movies and how we in the West portrayed Russians in movies. Can anyone, I see some smiles, what comes to mind when you think of how Russians are portrayed by Hollywood? Rambo. Very negative. Very negative. A lot of corruption, not very nice behavior. And that was very irksome to the Russians. They didn't like being portrayed that way. Interesting. So they began to look at how they could project themselves in a more positive way. Fast forward. There was this event over this summer. It was a summer. We can't even know if we're in summer now. But there was this major sporting event recently where Russia got to show itself to the world. What was the event? The Olympics. Sochi. Here we are talking about this negative Ukraine image. We've just come off Sochi. Does anyone see this sort of irony in discerning a strategy to improve your public standing and putting up these two events? Now it depends on who your audience is that you want to have this positive image of yourself. If you want it to be in the United States, you might tinker with those Hollywood films or put on the Olympics. If you want to influence your own domestic audience, well, maybe a land grab of Crimea and eastern Ukraine is just the thing. So part of public diplomacy is identifying your audience, figuring out your tools, measuring what it is you're trying to accomplish, and then having complex conversations with Jim Goldgeier about what this all amounts to. And I hope we'll hear from some of your students.
Right, so we're going to go to them in just a moment. But let's just follow this up for a minute because, let's say that President Putin over the last few months has been having conversations with media relations people thinking about the Russian image, right? You could
Where?
you could
The
make
Russian image where?
But you could make two very different arguments, right? One is you could say that you made all this effort to show the world that you could put on these Olympics, and despite everybody naysaying and telling you, you spent too much money and security was going to be a nightmare and all this stuff, you did it. The opening ceremony was beautiful. The closing ceremony was beautiful. The Russians won more gold medals than anybody else. It was perfect, right? And then you just threw it all away because now everybody looks at you and thinks you're just this big bully that's just gone and taken this territory. On the other hand, if it's all part of a narrative about Russia being back and Russia being being a major power on the world stage, it can do Olympics, it can take territory, it could all be, that narrative could
That
be a very
works.
different narrative, right?
So I think that narrative works with the but. And of course, the but has something to do with money. So let me come back to Moses and Egypt for a moment. So we decide we're going to punish the Pharaoh for bad international acting, bad behavior. What did we use as a club on Pharaoh? Plagues. 10 plagues. You could argue that the modern day equivalent of the plagues would be sanctions. Let's impose some harsh economic sanctions. Now, that's a tool in which you can exert some pressure. Will they work? Will they have impact? Will they, in a sense, disincentivize? I would turn back to the foreign policy practitioners and say, is that in the long term, this gambit you've made to show that you can do everything from sports to territory, pay off? What would you say?
Well, you got to figure out what his goals ultimately are. I mean, if what he wants is to demonstrate that this neighborhood is his and his to deal with in the manner that he wants without interference from the West, he may be willing to pay an economic price in order to demonstrate that.
Fascinating. I would love, as you folks ask your questions, to hear whether you think this Russian roulette will prove effective.
And whether we can, and sort of what it looks like from our standpoint in terms of our own ability to get our message out. Now, we've got mics. Amy, are we using, we have this one here, we're using both that and that. And then if people on the live stream want to ask a question, they can use the hashtag Dean's Discussion. You can use it here if you don't want to stand up and ask, and Amy will monitor that, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Good.
All right, so I just ask you, introduce yourself, and then ask a question.
Sherry Mueller, lucky enough to be on the faculty here. Tara, good to see
Good
you.
The
to see
SIS
you.
Dean's Council, we should also acknowledge that as well. So, and an alum.
And an alum. Wanted to ask you about the potential 13% cut, $30 million in the Fulbright program in the president's budget. Do you think maybe it was chosen because the administration knew there'd be such pushback from Fulbright, it would be reinstated? What's your take on that particular issue? Thank you very much.
So Sherry and others of us who believe deeply and passionately about study abroad and student engagement, and really salute Harriet Fulbright and her late husband who created the program. I would like to believe it's a tactic, because if there's one thing that members on both sides of the Hill understand, it's the power of study abroad and student engagement. And let me just give you, so I'm hoping it's a ploy and that it will just kind of rattle cages. But I want to point this out. Students coming to the United States and Americans going to study overseas is powerful, powerful public diplomacy. Powerful way in which we extend our interests, our principles, our national security. By what magnitude? I want to tell you by what magnitude we're talking about. How many international students do you think are on in the United States per year? How many? Somebody throw out a number. You think there are 1,000? How many? 100,000. Good number. Anybody else? 820. Somebody read Open Doors. 825,000. Now, how many, because of course you should ask the other direction, how many do you think go the other direction? U.S. overseas.
I don't know. We're going back to 100,000 as our answer?
A little more. We double that. About 200,000. Less than 10% of American students go abroad. And if I do anything today, I know it...
They're over 80% in the School of International Service go study abroad, so there you go.
If I make one campaign statement to every place I go, we have to increase the numbers of students who go overseas, as well as we welcome and beckon and be gracious. Because, by the way, those 825,000 students that come here, they don't just bring us the benefit of their cultures and their ideas. They contribute to this economy by the numbers of, per year, $22 billion a year is generated by the presence of international students on our campuses. So this is an issue that go home, wherever you go home tonight, to a dorm, to a dinner table, and say, I got to work on this study abroad two-way traffic. This two-way traffic is important to our country. So great question.
Well, I also, and I just would note that we're proud to house in SIS the 100,000 Strong Foundation, which is designed to promote, to answer the call of trying to send 100,000 Americans to study in China to match the numbers of Chinese students who come to the United States.
And of course, as I mentioned, the Chinese public diplomacy, they were on this very early. Culture, student exchanges, language, soft power. Have any of you ever opened up your Washington Post? Not that anyone reads the Washington Post, sorry, but I have, and I do. And have you ever noticed a supplement in there from China? Everybody's shaking their head. Did you order that supplement? Because I didn't order mine. How did that get in my paper? Who's paying for that? What's its impact? That's Chinese public diplomacy with your morning coffee.
Okay. Can we get the mic?
I'm so glad there's so many questions.
Thank you for bringing up the topic of international education. By the way, my name is Craig Hayden. I also teach here at SIS. I think it's tempting to think about public diplomacy as a battle over narratives around things like what's going on in Ukraine. But clearly, international education seems to be a pivotal, if not central role for public diplomacy. Are there other ways besides exchange programs we might think about international education as a sort of foundational element of thinking about public diplomacy moving forward?
Absolutely. Teaching English teaching and training, which is something done by Voice of America and by the State Department, by many organizations. Video gaming. While I was undersecretary, we had an initiative to teach English language online through video gaming. That is another education. MOOCs, online, massive online courses, using technology, virtual exchanges, 2.0. So using technology in much the same way that we're meeting face to face, imagine the exponential potential if you are creating virtual dialogue back and forth. Supporting schools around the world. Some think of as traditional development. I think is also good public diplomacy. What do I mean? When I visited, pick a country, Ukraine, as undersecretary, and I said, well, what shall I see that the embassy here does in the way of reaching Ukrainian citizens? What will be on my itinerary in Kyiv that will show off what the embassy does? We did 3 things, and make this very concrete in a very important part of the world. First, we went with the ambassador and knocked down a wall for the building of an American center in Ukraine. It was a little one that exists, and the notion was to build a bigger one. So we were literally doing the construction work on a center that would teach Ukrainians English, how to study abroad, come see an American movie, come just simple meet and greet. That is classic public diplomacy. Second thing, I said, what else shall I see that the embassy funds here that shows our values in Ukraine? They said, well, we fund a school that we'd like to show you. The video is online. The school is Kyiv 168, funded in part by the U.S. government. It is the first and one of the only schools for disabilities and non-disabled students in inclusive Ukrainian education. What does that say about us? That we would put dollars into the disabilities school in Ukraine. Tolerance, diversity, inclusion, pluralism, education. The third thing I did was meet with Ukrainian journalists. How are we supporting the media sector? Independent television. What would happen if there were a crisis? Could they report freely? How would they cover it? Would they have access? What if it were in Crimea or Donetsk? You just never know.
Well, I'm willing to take one more question from a faculty member, and then I want to see a student raise his or her hand. So we'll go to Ambassador Quainton up here. And if there's anything online, Amy will let me know as well.
Tony Quainton, a quick comment. The Russian supplement in the Washington Post is better than the Chinese supplement.
I was waiting for someone to see about the Russian supplement.
It's very effective and very nuanced. Anyway, but I want to put you back, or take you back, to General Marshall's office. Because it's often said by at least some of your predecessors that the key to successful public diplomacy as a bureaucratic function is to be present on the takeoff and not just responsible for the landings and explaining what went wrong. In your experience, how much has the department, as well as the Office of the Undersecretary, internalized this need to have public diplomacy at the start of the policy process and not just picking up the pieces at the end of it?
It is a relatively new formal function. And what the ambassador is referencing very wisely is that in some ways this function of public diplomacy has been grafted onto the State Department. And so there is still, as with any grafting, a process of the body accepting this function. And so much is dependent on personality and the individual policy and the takeoff, unlike, as I learned, because I loved the takeoff landing metaphor until I actually got to the State Department, and I realized that there isn't a scheduled takeoff and there certainly isn't a definite landing. So I quickly dispensed of it because you're always in mid-flight. But I'll give you an example of where Secretary Clinton had public diplomacy at the table on the takeoff. I guess this is public, but everything is. The secretary came into a meeting one morning and said she had just returned from Africa, and she was astonished at the degree to which wildlife trafficking in Africa and in other parts of the world had reached a pinnacle she really saw as a national security threat. We're talking about poaching of elephants, killing animals for ivory, and I teased, I said she was seized by the issue because a lot of it is the illegal seizure of animal parts. But she said, I want, in addition to all of the departments who look at wildlife trafficking from a criminal, economic, human rights, legal, I want public diplomacy in on this campaign because this is a consumer-driven issue. It's about people buying stuff and somebody going out and killing animals with very sophisticated equipment, with night goggle vision equipment. It's become almost like a terrorism form of trafficking. And I want a public education campaign. And she looked at me and said, lead it. That's a takeoff in a rare moment, but you can't in Syria policy say today we're going to take off or land. With discrete issues, I find it's easier to really see who's at the beginning, middle, and end. But in most issues, NATO, who's on the takeoff of NATO, we talked about enlargement and other issues, and where's the landing? So, depends. It's a great question.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up by just, you mentioned NATO. They now have a new position, Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy.
The Europeans have taken public diplomacy now very seriously. Why? A couple of reasons. One, they have begun to see that they have very diverse populations now in Europe, that they actually need outreach to Muslim audiences, that they actually have diaspora communities that have to be engaged, that they actually need at times to speak with one voice as Europe, and yet it represents, if you think it's hard at the State Department, try getting your NATO messaging or your EU messaging, trade, commerce. So they've rallied around the notion that we better think about this public piece, this communications piece, if we're going to have impact the way China does, Russia does, the United States.
So I'm Patrick Burnett. I'm a junior here in SIS. And I wanted to ask actually about the European Union. Last semester I studied in Berlin, and I focused on European affairs for my regional here in SIS. And one thing I noticed, aside from the whole NSA blow up over there, is a very interesting time to be an American in Germany. But one thing as well is I feel like in some ways in Europe in particular, we still rely on more traditional diplomacy more than anything else. And whereas we're doing like awesome efforts, say in Kiev and other parts of the world, I feel like Western Europe kind of looks at us as like we're kind of becoming old news. There's definitely distance. In Berlin, for instance, with the new U.S. Embassy, a lot of Berliners think it looks like a prison. They think it's like, oh, typical American, it's standoffish. What are we doing to try to help and rebuild our image somewhat with our critical allies in Europe?
Wonderful question. I am off in 2 weeks to Berlin for 3 events. One is with the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy in Berlin. They're looking at what are we doing on the cultural side of U.S.-Europe. The second is for the Aspen Institute, which is very active in Berlin, and then the Council on Foreign Relations. Everyone. There's a lot of buzz around Germany in particular right now because of Ukraine and other issues. But I think the answer is we have to invest in our public diplomacy officers in Europe, even though we don't think it's a conflict zone. public diplomacy is not just directed at Russia during a crisis. Your friends and allies are on the receiving end also of your public diplomacy. Donna, who's here, worked in Brussels, I believe, at the embassy doing public diplomacy. So we do have to go back to this. The younger generation of people for whom NATO sounds like a dinosaur term to them. How are we engaging that generation of Europeans and Americans in a dialogue that is more than just a transatlantic security dialogue, but is about culture and art and film and food? AU has great culinary diplomacy, and I've written with one of your professors about the power of food as a means of bringing people to the table. So it's a great, really great question.
And just to follow up on it, and then we'll go over to you. I mean, something like the NSA scandal breaks, the Snowden releases all these documents. It seemed like for much of the period, the administration was really in reactive mode. I mean, you'd be a release of a set of documents and it would have to react to it. And I kept thinking to myself, you know, we know there are going to be more releases. So how is it that we can't get out in front of this story? Why does it seem like the administration can only react to release, even though we still haven't seen the end of the documents?
I think when you get to sensitive security-related issues, you don't want to be too far ahead, because you don't want to disclose what may not be disclosed. And what you want to do at that moment connects right back to the question. You want to have set the table with the publics in question, in this case, the people of Germany, if you're going to have a disclosure about Merkel and her phone. You need these relationships that are built on public diplomacy, on public trust, on confidence. If your table has been well set, that relationship will survive the vicissitudes of a political cycle and a news cycle. If your educational exchanges have been robust, you will have a network of alumni who've been back and forth to one another's countries to make the relationship robust. It's where the table has not been set, where you've cut public diplomacy, where you haven't funded the disability school, where you haven't helped the media, that suddenly you're on shaky ground. And of course, we all respond to the crisis, but what the real work is up front. The work is before the crisis, in that prevention stage, in that sustainability stage. And yet what makes the headlines will be Snowden and the NSA, and people will look at the polls and do German citizens now don't like us, and what's our popularity? If undergirding that is a safe space and strong pillars of a relationship, you will endure.
You've been very patient. Go ahead. Yeah, we can take the mic.
My name is Becky Bach. I'm also a junior, and I think you just answered it very well, so my question is kind of mute at this point. But with the Pulitzer Prizes coming out yesterday, and Gelman and his whole team getting it, kind of where do you project that kind of going in the future, and like what is the international community thinking now?
I struggle with the prize yesterday because I believe in giving news outlets awards for investigative journalism and good reporting. I'm not sure what Mr. Snowden's category is, by which I mean journalist, whistleblower. The whole notion of putting all this documentation out on the internet, it's not the journalism I came from in the 1980s and early 90s. The media has changed. What we award as a Pulitzer Prize is a different kind of reporting. The kind of reporting that we see now is sort of like a roll of paper towels that you just kind of unfurl and just read quickly and rip off and post and repost. For some of us who came out of traditional media, it's still jarring because we had so many rules to the profession. So it's a changing, evolutionary time in communications, and I think the State Department, going back to public diplomacy and smart power, has to move with those changes, and they are. Will there be mistakes when you tweet from every corner and every embassy? Absolutely. Will the mistakes be enough to make you stop blogging and tweeting and having Facebook pages? No. Because for every mistaken tweet are billions of non-mistaken tweets. And so in the end of the day, we're going to have to keep pace as a government with those technological news, Pulitzer-driven changes if we're going to keep pace.
Yes, we'll go back here and then come up.
Hi, I'm a grad student here in the mid-career program. I have a couple questions. One is, the world seems to be saturated in American pop culture ideas. The private sector is doing a great job selling America. In my travels overseas, I saw it all over. And so why do we need to do public diplomacy by the government when the private sector seems to be doing it just fine? Secondly, do you see any connection, or what do you see as a relationship between, say, USAID-funded democracy and governance and human rights programs and public diplomacy? What's the connection or nexus there?
It's a great question, and I think we need both. It's not a zero-sum game. You need commercial diplomacy, and you need government-funded public diplomacy. Why? Because you cannot rely solely on the good nature and goodwill of corporations in selling their product, that they will necessarily always be advancing our national security goals and ideals. At the same time, you can't, as a government, nor can we afford to not be working with the private sector in what you see as public-private partnerships. So I think we need both. I think we can brand Pepsi and brand America, and there doesn't have to be a fundamental trade-off, but I sure wouldn't want to rely on Coca-Cola to pay for all the students or Fulbrights. I certainly wouldn't want to hope that companies would do the kinds of exchanges and programs that we as a country believe need to exist for that net. And will they pick every country? Or will they pick ones where there's a lot of people who buy a product, as opposed to building, would they have reached out to Ukraine to sell as many sneakers or tennis shoes as we would feel the need to reach out to Ukraine for our own national security interests? So I don't want to put those as one versus the other. On USAID and development, look, every time a USAID package of food or plane arrives in an earthquake in Pakistan or in Haiti, that's good public diplomacy. And the whole argument over branding these things, every time we go in after a crisis, a humanitarian crisis, we are demonstrating values of generosity, tolerance, pluralism. So I think it's important. All the development work, by the way, on schools, roads, projects, water, climate, you pick your area. Those health diplomacy, science diplomacy, those are important public diplomacy programs. And I love to, and I know we're getting to 5 o'clock, but how many of you have seen Gravity, the movie? So it's...
I still haven't seen it.
You still haven't seen it. Okay, so I won't spoil it. The woman goes off into space with, I think, George Clooney, and she gets sort of trapped there alone and has to get help from the International Space Station, and it's very dramatic. Imagine public diplomacy in space. You have to rely on the Chinese guy at the space station or the Japanese-speaking Russian cosmonaut might be your only lifeline. So U.S., Russia, we may be fighting it out about Crimea on the ground, but up there, full cooperation. No choice. And I give you another example. How many of you follow Malaysia Flight 370? All right, come on, I'll admit it. You know, it's gotten a little crazy, but we all follow it. That flight, that plane, had 12 people who hailed from 12 different countries, trapped in one pencil-like structure. And we can fight all we want between China and Japan over Senkaku Islands. But when it comes to searching for a missing plane, look how many nations are in that. And my last example, are you going to care if you have some tropical disease or cancer, whether the cure for your disease comes from a laboratory in Pakistan or in Africa or in the hemisphere? So all of this is about, at the end of the day, if we believe in this stuff, and obviously I do, I believe in this engagement, this cooperation, this public diplomacy. The goal is an international community that can weather the storm, literally, that can create something less hostile, less divided, more prosperous, more tolerant, so that everybody wins. And if you don't believe in some of that, then we kind of go back to caves and hunkering down and pulling the blinds and cutting public diplomacy and cutting Fulbright and not coming to American University and having great conversations.
All right, I've got two people left, so we're going to put both questions on the table, and then we'll let you answer as you wish. So we'll start over here.
Hi, my name is Will Patinos. I'm also a graduate student here in SIS in U.S. Foreign Policy. And my question is about sort of gauging the success of public diplomacy, which maybe was already discussed a little bit. I was a little bit late. So I'm curious, in a world where we're increasingly required to justify with analytics, data, and other ways, what are some of the strategies that you think we should be employing to show the success of these programs that sometimes, you know, isn't obvious for quite some time?
That's great. Okay, so measurement, and then we'll finish up with Joe.
My name is Joe Eldridge, and since I'm sitting next to one, just if you could talk a little bit about the role of ambassadors in public diplomacy, and I'm thinking about all the countries who don't have ambassadors. I know in the Latin American region, there are a bunch of countries without ambassadors.
Don't have
and
U.S.
how unhelpful is
right.
it when a country does not have
a U.S. ambassador.
a U.S. ambassador?
We don't have one in Russia right now, for example.
Yeah, we have 50,
For example.
about 50, I think, countries.
Vacancies, right. So how does that affect?
Put in a plug for our ambassador in Brazil, who is an SIS alumna. So just put that plug out there.
Good. So measuring, yes, yes, and yes. We have to measure impact of public diplomacy. We have somebody here who works on something called MAT. There has to be an acronym if you work in government. Mission Activity Tracker. We have to have our embassies tracking what public diplomacy they're doing and what impact it is having. So if I spend money on a disabilities inclusion school in Ukraine, I need to enter that I spent money on that project and what did it yield? Now, there you get into the difficult terrain. Did it yield something I can hold in my hand and show you at a hearing tomorrow? Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe I can show you that $22 billion came out of these international student presence here. Maybe I can show you state by state how the economy of a state was improved by the presence of an international student. Maybe I can show you that on day one of a program with Fulbright in Pakistan, we asked everybody in the room what they thought of the United States and what they wanted to do in the world. And maybe 2 years later, I could go back and say, you had been on this program with Americans. What did you think before the program? What did you think after? And what did you go on to be? And what if I could tell you that 92% of the people we looked at who went on one particular program, 92% of them went on years later to either work in the parliament, work in an NGO, work in a foundation. They actually took that international experience and made a lifelong commitment to it. Those are the kinds of quantitative and qualitative data we need to go back to Congress and say, how many Nobel Peace Prize winners came out of the Fulbright program? 50. How many Nobel Peace Prize winners will we not have if we cut Fulbrights? So that's one way we can measure. Ambassadors, we now have a program where ambassadors go on the air and do a video when they arrive at post. Now, at the beginning, the ambassadors were a little skeptical. I remember one, Nancy Powell, who's a wonderful ambassador to India, said, wait, you want me to make a video? What would I say? How would it work? Who would see it? What impact would it have? We talked her into it. She did a video about who Nancy Powell as a person is. That video was shown 9 quadrillion times in India when she arrived. The Indian public would stop her. You're the U.S. ambassador I saw on YouTube. You're the one who takes pictures with your camera. I like you. I like your country. Ambassadors are key, and their public diplomacy staffs, and people who serve in the public, like your wife, Maria Otero. People who give their career to going around the world and representing the best of us, the finest. Those are the people who change the world. And they're ambassadors, and they're public servants, and they're students, and they're business people, and they're journalists, and they're everyone in that extension cord. So thank you very much for having